Welcome, and thank you for attending our session, Using Learning Analytics to Support Students in the Academic Library. We're really happy that you're here with us. We have up on our slate 5 presenters today. I'm Megan Oakleaf, and I'm going to start by giving some context and background, but my colleagues will be engaging in discussion in just a little bit after we get that background and context. I want to acknowledge that we're all coming from different perspectives, different roles within our libraries, different types of institutions, different experiences with learning analytics in the library or as area of research. And so I do want to acknowledge that we have lots of different opinions, and hopefully we'll get to draw all of those out. So our goals that we had in mind, what we hope to achieve through this session, are listed here. We hope that by the end of the session, you'll be able to formulate questions to either begin or continue discussions about learning analytics at your libraries and at your institution, that you'll be able to anticipate common misunderstandings and/or conflicts that arise in conversations on this topic, and that you'll be able to describe some current work and research on the role of libraries and librarians in learning analytics. We know that this is a new-ish topic for libraries and librarians, and one that we have strong feelings about. Pretty much everyone has strong feelings about. And so our other hope is that we can have a productive discussion here in our recording, but also after the fact in the conference and in conversations that we have maybe as you reach out to us after the talk. We hope that you'll join us in taking a perspective and being committed to learning from each other and listening to each other, that we will all recognize that the differences in opinion and perspectives and experience will increase our learning rather than hinder it. We'll trust that we're all doing the best that we can and challenge ideas, not individuals. We want to acknowledge very gratefully the support of IMLS for some projects that will come up in our talk and have informed our experiences of learning analytics. There are 3 here we wanted to call out: Library Integration and Institutional Learning Analytics, or LILA, Connecting Libraries and Learning Analytics for Student Success, or CLASS, and the Library Learning Analytics Project. So I want to begin the context setting portion of our discussion here today with a definition and some examples, because this can be sort of a difficult area to pin down sometimes. Yeah, I struggle with it myself. So we're going to work from this definition as learning analytics as the use of institutional level systems that collect individual level student learning data, centralize it in a record store, and serve as a unified resource for understanding student success. A map of what that might look like is on our screen here. So it's a lot, but there's really 4 parts to this map. So first, we have data that comes from different parts of campus: student information systems data, operations data, learning management system, and so on. We move that data into, consolidate it and protect it in an institutional record store or a data repository, where we can analyze it based on research questions, not fishing expeditions, but vetted, approved, and agreed upon research questions. And then the results of that are viewable by the folks who need those results: students, faculty, educational partners, researchers, in order to achieve goals. The different shading for the library data and librarians being a part of that represents that in many cases, not all, but in many cases, librarians are not yet involved in this work or in learning analytics in their institutions generally. And that's why we wanted to have this discussion here today. A couple things to call out on this image. One is that the goal of the analysis piece is to yield shared understandings about what helps or what hinders student success, so that we can make large-scale changes that affect many students and make individual connections for students to help them in their learning journeys. One advantage of this approach is that we can leverage shared capacity. If you've wanted to do this kind of work but been stymied by not enough time, not the right skills, not enough people to go around, or doing the work of librarianing rather than doing this work, which is part of it, but sometimes can fall to the wayside, this is an opportunity to leverage shared skills across the academy and everyone brings their special skills to the fore, but no one situation or one group of people have to go it alone or do their work in a vacuum. Another big advantage of this work is also giving data back to students. We often have the data on the left-hand side of the screen, but students don't have it in hand in order to make good decisions for them, take actions, feel agency and empowerment over their own learning journeys. So all of that is sort of the general picture of learning analytics, but it can look really different in different institutional contexts. So in some situations, this sort of mapped ecosystem might be in place, but the institutional record store might be divvied up by college. It might be unified at one place in the institution. Each institution might really develop its own architecture. Some institutions, all of this is only in the planning and in thinking stages. At other institutions, there might have been a decision to buy a package from a vendor or a third party. And some of these packages developed by third parties or by vendors go by the term IPASS. You might have heard the phrase IPASS system, which stands for Integrated Planning and Advising for Student Success. And these have a great variety amongst them as well, but in general, they're intended to combine advising, early alerts, interventions, degree planning, and connecting students with their educational team. So again, giving students access to their own data, connecting them with supports, offering students agency to make their own decisions, and facilitate connections and as close to real time as we can get, because we know waiting makes for worse outcomes for students. You might recognize some of the vendor names on this slide as something you've heard talked about at your institution or maybe are even involved with directly at this point. So the purpose of all of these systems, whatever flavor you may have your campus thinking about or actually engaging with, they all have really the same intent. So learning analytics is intended to help educators discover, diagnose, predict challenges to learning and success, and create or deploy active interventions to benefit students, particularly those students who might be less familiar with the unwritten and oftentimes opaque rules for success in higher education. And we want to query those rules and try to dismantle the ones that are unfair, but we also need to arm students with an understanding of them at the same time and come at those challenges from both directions. So there was a word in there that feels very, I don't know, experimental maybe, an intervention. What do we mean when we say intervention? So interventions are basically doing something, right? Either on behalf of students or with students, in cooperation with students, to help students in their success journeys and their learning journeys, or to help them help themselves. And they really happen at two different levels, sort of a macro level, affecting many students, and an individual level. So at the large scale, at the macro level, what we're looking to do is discover hurdles, hindrances, obstacles that get in the way, and then put in place systemic and structural changes to practices or processes or policies or whatever is necessary to improve the learner's experience and remove those obstacles, to get rid of them entirely. And sometimes we initiate this work on behalf of certain groups of students. Oftentimes the changes that we make are beneficial for all students. And then the individual level is where we try to connect students and help them communicate with their educational team and the supports that they might find useful. So we can provide learners insights into their own learning behaviors so that they can use metacognition and reflection to take agency over their journey. Notify students and their educational support partners of important events, patterns, or milestones, and encourage students to gain assistance from support services when that's appropriate. So basically, things that good educators have always done, but the difficulty can be the scale of our institutions, and also a student's success shouldn't be dependent wholly on having a good and attentive instructor or advisor or what have you. So we want to augment what we already do on a personal level with making sure folks don't fall through the cracks because we are operating at such a scale, or we didn't notice because of something going on in our own lives. That's not fair. So before I start the broader conversation amongst my colleagues here, and I know you're waiting for that, I want to highlight some areas of misunderstanding and potential differences of opinion that you're likely to encounter in achieving those goals that we set out at the beginning, being able to talk to your library colleagues and institutional partners about this topic. So one of them is sort of clarification around what learning analytics is not. I tried to give a good definition, a working definition of what it is, but sometimes there are persistent misunderstandings or at least uses in the library community that don't match up with how other folks in higher ed talk about learning analytics. So general learning assessment or information literacy assessment, typically outside our walls, the term learning analytics wouldn't be applied to that. Or a one-time episodic look at correlations between experiences that the students have and outcomes would also not sort of qualify under this term. It's also, learning analytics is also not primarily about library value, although we all have to acknowledge that in order to be able to do the good things that we do in libraries, we have to have resources to do them. But learning analytics isn't primarily about that. Rather, learning analytics is really one approach amongst many. So many of the ways that we listen to and understand student experiences have gaps, right? So surveys might have low response rates, or lots of non-responders, maybe some of the folks that we most want to hear from. The responders themselves might not be representative, or the groups that we want to hear from might be such a small number within that we can't report or fully understand their perspectives. Also, surveys, like many other approaches, are self-report and may or may not accurately depict what is actually happening. Performance assessments, which are near and dear to my heart, are so time-consuming that the sample sizes are almost always necessarily very small, rather than looking at an entire population. And other approaches that are super effective in their own ways, focus groups, ethnography, interviews, can require a lot of labor from students. And that might be additional labor that is just too much. We want to expend that where we most need it. And so learning analytics can help us scan in an ongoing way, longitudinally over time, for areas of concern that we know that there might be a problem, and then use those other approaches to delve more deeply into what the problem is, why it's happening, how we can correct it. And so it has an opportunity not to replace those other approaches, but to have an additional strength so that we can see where to look. It's not a panacea, it's just one tool in the toolbox. And finally, learning analytics is primarily about understanding and supporting student learning. That's why we undertake this work. So let's talk also about those tricky areas, areas that you can anticipate coming up in your discussion. And I'm just going to highlight 7 areas and not try to cover them in depth, because that would take quite some time. But I want to just at least raise these, highlight these as things that you might expect to encounter in your conversations. I also want to say that in the way I've displayed this on the screen, I am not trying to set up either or situations, but acknowledge that folks come out with many different perspectives on these topics. I'm representing some that I hear quite a bit, but they're not either or choices. People fall along a continuum, and we need to have discussions about these topics in order to come to the best choices for our students, our libraries, and our institutions. So having said that, 7 topics that I think you should expect to come up in your discussions. Obviously, privacy is super important to this work, and understanding how we can deal with answering questions that we need to understand in order to help students, when we can do that with de-identified or anonymized data, and when we need identified data, and how we can protect that identified data, keep it safe, keep it secure, keep it confidential. And so having conversations around the options here for how we protect student privacy while still acting on students' behalf and in conjunction with students is a really important area of discussion to be prepared for. Understanding and dealing with the responsibility of having additional data is another area that you'll want to be prepared for. In some cases, librarians might not need a tremendous amount of information about students, the kind of information that advisors and faculty have. But in other cases, we might need to know more about their coursework and their academic lives and where they're experiencing challenges. And so if we get, through learning analytics, more detailed information about our students, we might be able to make decisions and take actions with them and on their behalf. We also then have to talk about what the ethics are around having data that we don't act on, right? So there are ethics all over the place that we want to value and honor. But one of those is thinking about, if we know more, can we do more? If we know more, must we do more? And what are the implications of that? What are the obligations of knowing and needing to act with that information? Yeah, okay, sorry about that. A third area for discussion is thinking about the level of understanding of student learning that we can get out of various approaches and what learning analytics might add to that. So right now, many campus conversations are really focused on persistence, retention, velocity to completion or graduation. And learning analytics gives us an opportunity, should we wish it, to understand more about learning outcomes in terms of actual learning. So those other things are surrogates for learning. We might be able to understand more about actual learning by having access to faculty or librarian or other folks' judgments of student learning in their courses and their assignments. So we might be able to get to a more detailed level of understanding how things we do in the academy, specifically libraries and otherwise, and how that impacts what students actually learn as evidenced by their academic work. Equity and inclusion is something that we all want to take action on rather than just talk about. And so we need to think about how this work also is informed by our values around equity and inclusion. So right now, we may lack data about our students or have very simplistic data that's boiled down to one or two aspects of their identities. There might be opportunities, should we wish to embrace them, that will allow us to understand more about students' intersectional identities. So including things that we maybe have in the student information system, also with their courses that they're taking, their year in school, a program, extracurricular, student affairs, student engagement types of things, and understanding how specific intersectional, multidimensional identities impact their success or struggle achieving their own success. So we need to think about what we could do if we knew more about students and understood how different elements in their lives are at play. We also need to think about what happens when we don't know those things. And whether or not certain groups of students go uncounted and therefore underserved, more marginalized, invisible, or even ignored, although that would never be our intention. That might be the actual impact. So one example of that from recent times is COVID. When we lost eyes on students, we lost a lot of information about their experiences, their frustrations, their successes, and many assessment projects using our typical methods ground to a halt or were really difficult to continue because we lost that access. But what we know is there's lots of students we don't see all the time anyway. So even in non-pandemic times, there's a lot to talk about in terms of making sure we really fully understand students, and if we don't, whether those trade-offs are things that we can live with. 3 more things. We're getting to it. All right. So thing number 5, area of discussion number 5, we need to talk about labor, and not just librarian labor and how hard things are to do, but student labor. We oftentimes rely on assessment approaches that require students to give a lot of their time and energy and input, and that's valuable. But we might want to think about where we do that and how we might be able to use learning analytics to pinpoint those places where those more in-depth approaches that ask more of our students can be most effective, and where that approach is merited. Last 2 are a little more straightforward. Who should make the data decisions, right? So, if we do nothing, who will make the decisions for what data is collected? How do we want to influence that conversation? We have to be at the table to be able to make those decisions. So thinking about who should be involved, what kind of library data is acceptable and useful and appropriate and right to collect and use, and what would we never want to touch. And we should have those conversations amongst ourselves, our students for sure, because it's their data, and also our other educational partners on campus, so we understand what we need to know to answer the questions that are most necessary to answer. And then finally, the question of access. the data that we ultimately come up with, who should have access to that. And we looked at that for even from the beginning, the initial map, so getting data back into students' hands so that they can use it into our hands appropriately so that we can make decisions around services, spaces, collections, and so on to best serve students, and of course, educational researchers. But who else is in this mix, and who else should have access, or what should it take to be granted access? So for me, keeping the focus on students, as our title says, we want to focus on supporting students. So students and their supporters are the ones that are most likely to have access or most need to have access. But as I said, that's an area for discussion. Okay, so speaking of said discussion, we're almost there. So the last thing I really wanted to say about this before I turn it over is, why might libraries want to get involved in this work? And some of these ideas might have already come to you, but I wanted to sort of summarize a few of them. So we know that right now, not that few libraries collect and contribute detailed data to centralized stores. And there are consequences to that. Some of the ones I've already touched upon, but I think they're worth restating. So one of the things that might happen if we do not become involved, and why we might want to become involved, is that without this information, we may design or continue to design for average, with aggregated information that comes from self-reports, maybe not actual behaviors and patterns, inadequately representative samples, not enough information, or lack of depth or multidimensionality to understanding students and their identities. And if we provide mediocre or ill-informed or designed for average services, we can do harm. We can continue to have inequitable services, or unintentionally create more inequities rather than take them away, reduce them, dismantle them. Also, from a campus perspective of trying to understand student learning, we go uncounted. The dangers of being uncounted is that we render the campus data picture incomplete. They might miss things about what students need to be successful. Incomplete data is necessarily bad data, and so we contribute to that problem. We're challenged to answer questions about how we help or hinder student learning and success. And if we're not participating in the conversation, we may cede our roles as essential and influential educational partners helping our students succeed. And then finally, those values about confidentiality and privacy that we hold so dear, we might not be able to share our unique perspectives on that with the rest of our campus partners if we're not involved in the discussion. Okay, finally, the discussion. So I want to turn this over to my colleagues. I'm still going to play MC a little bit and asking some initial questions, but then they'll take it from there. They've been waiting patiently. So I'm going to start first with Joe. Can you talk a little bit more about what is this thing, this learning analytics thing, from a practical and experience based perspective?
Absolutely. Thanks, Megan. Yeah, it looks different, I know, at all of our places. I'll just speak to my local situation here at the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh. And I could really, as you were talking about the different, sources of impetus and the different things that went into it, I could totally identify, and I know my colleagues could as well. All those things we wanted to, to continue to identify, how we could better serve students. And so there's just a lot to consider. But going from more of an isolated, libraries are good at collecting data, but a lot of it is maybe esoteric in that we understand what the data, the intelligence means. But our move to incorporate into our kind of coordinated learning analytics platform on our campus meant that we were plugging into a larger platform, and we weren't just keeping library data within the library. We were sharing it. So specifically for public services, our instruction data in the form of, for example, workshops or classes we kept and logged, were not broadly shared on campus, right? Not on administrators couldn't have kind of a ongoing, immediate understanding of what we were doing and how we were instructing with students, maybe more in like kind of year-end reports and things of that sort. In the fall of 2016, that was the first rollout for our kind of coordinated care or IPASS system, and the library wasn't included. It was rolled out to your departments like professional advising units and things of that sort. And so by virtue of relationships and kind of advocating for our inclusion, we were able to get a seat at the table and and then be instrumental in developing some policies that could reflect some of our professional ethics as librarians. So that was very positive. And so going again, kind of more esoteric, isolated information to participating in the campus. It's like we're speaking the same language by virtue of participating, and helping to coordinate between administration, students, faculty, and different student support services.
I think those are good points, Joe, and I want to augment those a little bit. Ken Varnum from the University of Michigan. And I think that this kind of move into integrating library data into broader campus library data analysis and collection provides a welcome opportunity to move the library from thinking purely about how well we do, and we generally do very, very well at serving our customers, serving our students, serving our faculty. Today, we're focusing on students, of course, to moving in a different direction, which is how does that service help the student succeed in the long term? We've always, most of our libraries, or many of our libraries, are smack dab in the center of a campus. We hold that intellectual heart of most campuses traditionally. And while I have absolutely no doubt that we are critical to the success of students and to the success of faculty, it is never bad to be able to show it. There are those on campus that would like to they like numbers more than they like stories. And students, I think, need to understand that doing the work and doing the research in the library, while I'm sure they understand this intellectually, I know I understood it at that point, in a practical sense, how that helps them move ahead, how that helps them explore and discover and take advantage of the opportunities they have is critical. So in terms of making those arguments and demonstrating that use and making changes to existing services and existing interactions with students on a one-on-one or in a class or a one-shot instruction session, being able to make those connections over time to show that places where the libraries had a direct relation or direct interaction with a student in one of those contexts actually makes a difference. And I'm assuming it does. If it doesn't, then we're doing something wrong, and we need to know that also. And so we can improve what we do so that our difference that we hope we're making is in fact being made. And I think that is a gap that we have not been able to demonstrate and have too often not been willing to go down that path for various reasons. I think now we have an opportunity and affordances to make those connections in ways that were not previously possible. It's not simple, it's not straightforward. As Megan outlined, there are many conversations that need to happen to move in this direction. Many of them have happened in my library, many of them are still happening in my library. And I anticipate they will continue to happen in my library as we learn more and experience more and we get more student input and understand better how to do this well.
I'm Felix Kabo. I'm research faculty at the University of Michigan, and I'll build on what Ken said, but also reach some of the things that Megan mentioned earlier. If you look at what's currently being done, you see that there are some individuals and groups using de-identified or aggregate data. And what we know from that is it's hard to use that to identify inequalities, since that we cannot link individual students to outcomes that can help us pinpoint the inequalities. Things like using library circulation data, well, those don't really advance our understanding of learning over time. And then there's a lot of work that is survey-based, and that tends to have a number of, where my research had a number of problems, both ranging from whether it's small sample sizes to design quality issues, low response rates, and sometimes all of the above. And what that does is it makes the surveys not representative of the student population, even at the institutions where the surveys were administered. But equally, or even more importantly, then it means the findings from the surveys are not generalizable to the student population at large, to students across the nation. So having said that, I'd just like to highlight that line analytic activities have been ongoing in higher education over the last couple of decades. And the reality is, whether or not libraries get involved, it will not stop these activities. However, the flip side of that is the lack of library data gives us a very incomplete picture of student learning. So there's a big piece missing in that narrative of what's happening to our students from when they matriculate, when they go through the gates to our campuses. And that missing piece, that missing link is library data. So what I'd advocate for, what we really need is library learning analytics using longitudinal data that have identifiers, but data that are representative. And this, because it's only by using representative data that we can identify the inequalities linked to student performance and the student experience. And this is the approach that we've been advocating for with the Library Learning Analytics Project, or LAP. I'll call it LAP from now on. And I'll say that a benefit of libraries integrating into this existing line analytics ecosystems is, one, it will very likely highlight the relevance of the library in the learning process, but also it will make people more aware of just what impact the library has on student performance and student outcomes.
Thank you, guys have set me up so nicely to talk about some things we're doing at UNC Charlotte. I'm the head of assessment for the library at UNC Charlotte. I'm Becky Croxton. So at UNC Charlotte, we've kind of just jumped in with both feet in library learning analytics. And actually, we the library have moved beyond the traditional library correlational studies to conducting analysis that allowed us to identify an actual engagement pathways for student success using some statistical analysis techniques called propensity score matching and logistical regression analysis. But just to back up a little bit, for the past several years, the library, we've been leading a campus-wide study. Now we have, I think, 17 campus units and departments who are now working with us to contribute their data. So we amassed this gigantic data set about students' engagement with co-curricular and extracurricular activities and services, including the library. And we've aligned that. We worked with our Office of Institutional Research to align all of these engagement data longitudinally going back to 2012-13 academic year to the present. So it's identifiable data. We have more than 90,000 student records in this gigantic data set. And we've aligned that with measures of student success. You can define that in a lot of different ways. And Megan mentioned some of the ways that campuses are working with this, the year-to-year retention, time to graduation, graduation rates, sometimes cumulative GPA. So that's kind of subjective depending. There's a lot of factors that go into that. But we've aligned all of the engagement data with those measures of student success, and also brought in information from the student information system, the demographic information. And doing all of this has allowed us to, conduct analyses to better understand the intersectionality of the students' background and their experiences, also allowing us to kind of, when we're doing our analyses, control for some of those pre-college variables, the demographics, other things like that, and allow us to really hone in on the kind of the key high impact co-curricular and extracurricular activities that are helping students succeed. And it's been really beneficial. We start with a list of all of the students. So then we can identify the engagers and the non-engagers, and then kind of dig a little deeper and understand not only who are engaging and succeeding, but then who are we missing. So it's been a really, really eye-opening, a lot of hard work, but really valuable.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was a great answer. Many great answers to what is this thing. So thank you for helping us understand and get some access to it. So how do we do it? This thing, this learning analytics. Let's start with Becky.
Oh, here we go again. So in thinking about this question, or really this set of questions, there are literally hundreds of different action research questions that library learning analytics can help answer. And when I'm teaching students about research methods, I always say, always start with the question first. So the Leela report that Megan mentioned early in the presentation is a great place to start. So in this report, there's a ton of information, but there are beautiful outlines of questions you can answer with learning analytics that will help you understand the impact or steps towards improving your communication with students, improving services, instructional decisions, managerial decisions, and more. For example, you may be interested in learning whether there are relationships between students' use of library services and resources and their academic success, their persistence, those things I mentioned earlier. And in understanding this, then helps us or others take an informed approach to tailoring or promoting our library services or resources to better meet the needs of different students based on their different needs or incoming experiences, and more broadly, help the institution prepare for the changing student demographic landscape. So this is primarily where we've been spending most of our energy at UNC Charlotte. So in our work, we've aligned at the student level all of those things I talked about, but yearly counts going back to 2012 of each student's participation in library instruction, their easy proxy and open Athens authentications, the number of books they checked out, number of study rooms they reserved, the number of logins to computer, use of specialized spaces. It sounds like a lot of stuff, but in doing that, we're able to kind of explore which things are highly associated with student success, which things may be making a difference. And then, we are including in our studies, like things like if a student's an underrepresented minority, are they Pell eligible, understand their pre-college history a little bit, things like that. Are they coming in with transfer credits? So if we didn't have all of that information, we wouldn't be able to understand the nuances of their experiences and how we can tailor our work accordingly.
So building on what Becky said, now I work in the library IT side of things, so I immediately gravitate towards the quite literal how we do this, how we move data around, what we do to it in order to enable the analysis that my colleagues who are the statisticians and the assessment librarians, everybody on this call but me basically, what they are expert in. And getting the data from a source system into something that you can analyze is not a straightforward or simple process. As you might recall from this slide that Megan showed earlier on, there's all these different data pools that drop data sources that drop data, a lot of different ways into some central repository where it's analyzed. And the magic or some of the hard work that is invisible largely is getting the data from those strange, obscure library systems that we all know and love into a campus data store or a library data store of some variety. And I want to talk just really briefly about one path that can make that better, which is the result of one of the IMLS grants that was listed at the beginning of this presentation, the class grant. The goal of this, one of the outcomes of this work, was to generate a specification for library data that falls within the broader Caliper specification. Now, Caliper is an IMS global specification that is commonly used across all sorts of campus information systems and learning management systems, to do just this, to take data and put it into a standardized form, to transfer it into a data store where it can be analyzed. Through the work done in class, there's specifications now to work with library data. Now, this doesn't mean that it's at a plug and play level yet, although several of us who were in the class project have been talking with some of the big library vendors about ways that this could be integrated into future versions of the products. But even if you only have access to log files, and you have some, access to some developer types who can help transfer data in this form to data in that form, you can start contributing your data into the system. What is nice about this is that the specification defines a user as simply a kind of a user. You as a library or you as an institution have the flexibility within the specification to be just as specific and identifying about that user, or just as broad as your research needs and your campus and library policies require. So if you are interested in first-year students and their use of the library reference services, and that is the data you wish to collect and analyze, then you can do it at that level. You may need to know something about the individual to be able to abstract them to just a first-year student, but what you store and work with then is at that general level. On the other hand, if you are looking to contribute that information into an IPASS system and to be able to send signals to the students, that those students who talk to librarians in the course of their first seminar, where they have to write a significant research project, then maybe you actually need to know who they are. If they're enrolled in this class, you can know who they are. So there are paths that allow you at the right level of granularity to analyze this data. And that is really, I think, something that is important. It helps add flavor and context to some of those tough conversations that are always facing us in libraries and on campuses as we try to figure out what to keep, what to share, and how to analyze it.
Oh, Joe, please unmute.
Thanks, Megan.
You win the
Yeah,
prize.
it's the balancing, right? So thanks, Ken. So at Oshkosh, it's a little different in terms of, you mentioned the IPASS system, and I'd mentioned previously that our campus adopted, well, the whole system kind of a few years ago, had an agreement with EAB to purchase their student success platform. And so as I mentioned, we were able to get into the second rollout. So what does that mean concretely? It means that as a unit in a library, our public services unit, we started to identify what types of data sources we wanted to feed to the platform and why we wanted to do so. So, when you have a more of a restricted use kind of model or way of thinking as a librarian, you don't really have any fears about compromising privacy, right? But when you begin to contribute, for example, like what we did to a campus platform, it requires kind of a bigger commitment to acting responsibly. And so we needed to review and make a thoughtful and intentional effort to apply our professional ethics and become more familiar with standards like the National Information Standards Organization's principles when we identified the types of information we wanted to include in the platform. So for example, when we began keeping records of reference transactions, for example, we needed to address the issue of informed consent. So a lot of, one of the conversations was, was it necessary? And if it was, how would we communicate that? And expectations are different in different circumstances. So, the conversation regarding consent in our participation in classrooms was different than in maybe reference encounters, where again, it's assumptions and the circumstances are different. So it's just a really rich conversation we needed to have Currently, our data sources include information related to reference transactions, whether they be virtual, email, walk-ups, and all of our instruction, whether it's online and in class, and specifically, who attended those classes. And that's where we are currently. And that's so after a transaction or encounter, whether it's in the classroom or reference encounter, we will make a record of that into the system.
Yeah, so I'd just like to take a minute to talk about the work we're doing with LAP. And work or research, our studies are informed by a theoretical framework that is based on what we've seen from models of information behavior, from research on the links between factors such as campus residency and library instruction and student outcomes and student performance. But even, and this is very salient in the context of the pandemic, work on the digital divide, digital disparities. So we use this framework to develop studies for different types of users in our university community, but I'll just highlight some that focus on undergraduate students. We've completed some studies that have examined the associations between library usage, and here what we're really talking about is online access to library licensed content, which we're able to capture via the proxy server, Easy Proxy, and undergraduate student performance. We've done a study that has examined the impact of library curriculum integrated instruction and student performance. And then in the works right now is a white paper or a concept paper that's looking at the lab project, the overview of how did we do this and what have we done and what are the issues that we've encountered. And last, I'd like to mention a paper or a study that is looking at the factors of online usage, demographic factors, factors such as what's the academic affiliation of students. So we have a stable of different types of studies looking at different users, but they're all informed by a theoretical framework.
Thank you, Felix, and Joe, and Ken, and Becky. All right, so we're moving on to the next question, the third theme that we want to cover, which is what's the point? Why? What's the impact? We'll start with Felix on this one.
Yeah, thanks again, Megan. So there are many things you can do with library learning analytics. I would just like to focus on inequalities. If you go back to March 2020, we moved from a residential model to an online model. And one of the things that became apparent almost right away was that students were no longer able to walk into a library and interact physically with materials, which meant that the only way they could interact with the library and the materials in the library was online, virtually, through, and in many cases, through the proxy server. Now, when university presidents and provosts were making the decision to shut down our campuses, the last thing on their minds was for the students that had to leave the campus and go home, what are the digital resources available to them, right? Do they have broadband? Do they have a reliable high-speed internet? Because as we found out, especially when you have many people on Zoom in your house, it's important to have reliable internet to do school by Zoom. But even a lot of the resources that the library hosts that are accessible online, you need to have a good, reliable internet. And the fact is, not all students have access to that. So one of the things we've been looking at are what, if any, are the digital inequalities in our student population. And we've run regression models that show that underrepresented minorities are at a disadvantage when it comes to accessing library resources online. So on that basis, so we've gone from being able to do that now to where now we're writing a manuscript that is looking at the racial differences in our student population with respect to online access to library licensed content. And of course, then the next step would be, how can we take these findings and work with folks in the library, folks like Ken, to say, how can we mitigate these inequalities?
I guess I'll pipe in. So Felix talked about racial disparities and digital disparities. And at UNC Charlotte, just really kind of an anecdotal story, we are a school with a high transfer student population. We have about 30,000 students and about 40,000 that 40 or about 40% of them are transfer students. In our transfer students, their persistence rate is lower and their graduation rates are lower than the first time in college freshmen. So our dean and I, we conducted a study with this data set I've just been describing to try to dig in to get a better understanding of the transfer student experience, how they engage with the library, and try to identify engagement pathways for success by looking at students whether in their admission status and the number of incoming credits they had. So, you can transfer in with 24 credits or you can transfer in with 60 or more credits in your junior status. So we looked at the data in a variety of different ways. And in doing so, we learned that the engagement pathways for success differ depending on their admit status and their number of incoming credits. And in this study, we were also controlling for demographic variables, residency, participation in high impact practices, the college they're enrolled in. So the pathways for success differ and the way the students engage with the library differ. Like the incoming transfer students with 24 credits, like that lower group, have tended to use the library much less overall than their counterparts in the other groups. And when they do use the library, it's been more use of physical equipment and spaces. So we've learned which engagement activities increase the odds for success to the greatest degrees, depending on their subgroup and where they're not engaging with us. And with that, then we're now able to work on different approaches for how to reach and promote, to tailor to reach and promote our services and resources that's nuanced depending on these different subgroups of students or subpopulations.
Great, and from my perspective, I kind of see it where we're at Oshkosh is that since we're part of a broader system, and the system board is made the contract with EAB for the purchase of the product in 2018 for, I believe it was for like 5 years and $10.8 million. The goal at the system level was to take advantage of predictive data analysis to make changes. For example, if they're they've alluded repeatedly, especially in the beginning stages, where that if there are uncovered certain weed out classes, for example, what curriculum changes could be made. Maybe there's a certain critical path for nursing that seems to have a high correlation with pathway completion. You want to be able to communicate that to students early. But the library is a critical piece of this puzzle, as well, as we've kind of identified earlier, that our services are highly correlate, do have an impact. And by contributing to this LA, that we can identify maybe problems and things, outreach changes that we can make as a department, right? So for example, we before COVID, we internally investigated key information literacy related classes for freshmen, and we were able to compare participating and non-participating sections. And then at the student level, which students were present, which ones weren't. And then we worked with the Office of Institutional Research and to identify trends and patterns that will enable us to make more thoughtful changes in our instruction going forward. So yeah, it's been very, very useful.
That's wonderful. So that all sort of forces the question of, what's next? We've heard about some successes so far, but what's coming down the road? Ken, let's begin with you.
Sure, thanks, Megan. So I think that if one of the things that's next is for libraries like mine to start more actively seeking appropriate partnerships on campus with researchers who may not really think about library data in the context of their own educational outcome research, or with partners on campus who are already doing great work on working in student outcomes, and again, may not have thought about library data, either because they haven't thought about the library as part of this ecosystem in the way that we librarians would love them to, or perhaps it was the absence of data, or they've already asked and it's like, no, we don't have any data, or no, we can't give you that data, or no, we have no idea how to give you that data, although we have it. I think that the opportunity here is to find one of those, find some of those partners and join those conversations at the campus level. See what is going on your campus and suggest the places that you have data that you might want to add to the set that is already being analyzed. Felix mentioned a couple of very interesting projects, and I say interesting, I was involved in that other grant as well, so I do find it interesting. But the work with that he has led on the various disparities in broadband access or access to library resources, I suspect that there is something akin to that has happened in this past year at just about every campus and probably every K through 12 institution in the country, if not the world. Being able to demonstrate the places that the library might be able to better serve those students in some way, or the campus might be, or institution might better serve those students, whether it's through provision of hotspots or enabling broadband access, or seeking essentially low bandwidth versions of the videos that we already provide to our campus. Many of us academic campuses do a lot with high production value video content. While that may not have an equivalent, a one-to-one equivalent on the low bandwidth side, maybe there are ways to find that or to identify those as possible resources to acquire, to work with faculty to identify those so that students who are disadvantaged on the technological side, for whatever set of reasons, they live in the country, they don't have the wherewithal to acquire it, broadband doesn't reach them, to be able to provide an equivalent. Again, through the class, the caliper specification, the caliper profile for libraries I mentioned earlier, and if I would suggest that if you're interested, look at the resource that will be in the resource list that we're sharing towards the end of the presentation. Find ways that you might put the right level of your data into a campus learning store so that it can be analyzed, and treat it as a pilot and see what you can learn, see how you can improve the student experience, and make sure that the service you're providing is the service that is most beneficial to the students who you are serving.
Yeah, and I think that, the cycle you kind of described, Ken, I could, in terms of our campus, I think that's what's next for us. We carved out using the data we had and our participation. We were able to explore a problem or an issue and get some insight. I think the next step is kind of go from that small foray into identifying what other questions or problems we might want to explore. And great, I see, I think you got the make an action plan. Yeah, it's this cycle that, it's just, that's the most helpful, right? And I think, Becky, when you described the process you went through as a university, I think it's getting more familiar with the process, right? So you identify what user story or question you want to tackle, what do you want to know, and then figure out, all right, what data will we need to explore, and every situation is different. And then have those conversations and the policies. So that's next for us. What next question are we going to be looking at? And then I just want to maybe note to the an ACRL toolkit that was put out by Val subcommittee. And I'm very much looking forward to using this. This is heavily, this is published in the fall of 2020 for the first time. And it makes, much use of the projects that we've identified in this presentation, principally Leela, the Leela project and the class project. And there's such a rich resources available. But this toolkit kind of goes through the process of identifying, for example, under the potential outcomes tab, it makes note of some of the sample user stories that Leila identified as helpful for librarians and libraries to look at as potential maybe questions or things you want to explore or know, what kind of outcomes do you want to explore. And then there's a sources of data tab that kind of reviews the different data streams that you can maybe look at, maybe some sources you don't have, and may help you identify what question is going to be appropriate or user story is going to be appropriate for your library. And then we also have a leading libraries tab and that'll continue to grow as well in terms of people that you can contact at different institutions. Maybe there's a contact that's at an institution that is more comparable to where you're at. And so hopefully we can continue to grow that tab so people can identify other people, contacts that are in their same boat, right? And then there will also be a bibliography tab that will continue to grow and serve as a resource too. So I'll be using that. I and our department will be using this resource in the future. So.
Yeah, so I'll just take a quick minute to say that as you make your action plan, you may want to consider the lab guide to library analytics that we're developing, the outline of which should be up on our website. So there are about 12 steps in that outline. I won't go through all of them. I'll just focus on the first and the last one. And the first one is recommend that you define your goals and timelines. And this is where you go through, what are your operational objectives on the research side, what are your research goals, what are your milestones, and what are your deadlines. The last one, and so obviously if you go through all the steps and you have some really interesting novel findings, that's not sufficient. I think you then, to borrow from the world of medicine, you need to go through a process of translation, which is how do you take those findings and convert them into a policy or an intervention that can actually improve the lives of students. And in the case of some of the inequalities that we mentioned, how do you mitigate those inequalities? That's what we mean by translation. So we hope that you consult with that guide and hopefully find it useful.
And just building on what Felix was talking about at UNC Charlotte, we didn't even know about the library learning analytics project at the time, but we found ourselves needing to go through all of these steps. So, our first meeting, we started out talking, we brought together the library dean, the head of the Office of Research Integrity, the IRB people, the Office of Institutional Research, the Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, the Director of the Office of Assessment and Accreditation, and then co-curricular units who were either co-located in the library or like across the sidewalk from us. And we just sat around a big table and kind of thought about what was possible, what was feasible, and what might make a difference, what might make a meaningful contribution. So we started off just talking and thinking about what did we want to know. Then we figured out what data we wanted to include, or what data would help us answer those questions. And then our library dean and I brought all of this idea to our library steering committee, the library decision-making body. And they said, oh, we're not so sure. And so then we backed way up and worked on issues related to privacy and kind of setting our comfort level of what we were willing to do, what kinds of data we were willing to include and at what level, kind of the stuff that Ken talked about with class and the caliper profile. So we conducted that data audit and addressed our issues of privacy. We aligned our privacy statement with the institution's policy, but then even, kind of fine-tuned it for library stuff. And then, like I said, the IRB people in the Office of Institutional Research have been constant partners with us. And that's been monumental. And we've started out as a grassroots effort, but finally the Institutional Research Office and the Provost Office realized this really matters. And so now they're making plans to develop an institutional data store. So it's not just a homegrown thing. So it's been really a learning process and really a great experience.
So I want to take a moment to thank Becky, Ken, Joe, and Felix for all sharing your experiences and your expertise. I think we'd all encourage you to also join us in making our action plan of who we need to talk to continually, right? What data we can use, what questions need to be asked and answered, and what policies, procedures, and processes we need to update, and so on. We'd also welcome you reaching out to talk to us individually or as a group. We want to continue this conversation as much as we possibly can with you all. So don't hesitate to send an email or set a meeting or what have you. So thank you all for coming. We hope it was a good use of your time. We certainly enjoyed it. Thank you.